let's take a moment as we begin our session this evening, just putting ourselves in God's presence, realizing that God is here with us as we focus this evening on something that's really important to us. You probably are familiar with this little reflection or some prayer. It is ascribed to Father Pedro Arrupe. Father Pedro Arrupe was the general of the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, early 80s. His cause for canonization has been introduced. He was quite a leader in our order and also in the church. But I chose it this evening because it has to do with the topic of our conversations. It has to do with the subject we're studying this evening, which is freedom, unfreedom, and disordered attachment. So let us begin. Nothing is more practical than finding God. That is, falling in love in a quite absolute, final way. What you are in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will decide what will get you out of bed in the morning, what you will do with your evenings, how you spend your weekends, what you read, who you know, what breaks your heart, and what amazes you with joy and gratitude. Fall in love. Stay in love. And it will decide everything. It's kind of a dramatic way of putting what we're doing here, what the spiritual life is ultimately about, because as we've been seeing, and I think you saw it not only in the first presentation that we had, the first session, but certainly in the second session that Father Brendan Bussey provided regarding spiritual movement, that it's a movement always of life and love, toward love. In other words, that's what defines it, and we should really never lose sight of that. And the other thing is that this reflection helps us see the analogy that we can make between the experience of the life of prayer, the spiritual life, the life in the spirit, as we call it, okay? The analogy between that reality and something that I think a lot of us human beings maybe know something about or have some ideas about, and we hope even experience of, which is falling in love. So, in our Christian way of thinking, freedom is for something. In other words, it's not so much or primarily freedom from something, but it's freedom for something. And ultimately, in our Christian spiritual heritage, it's freedom to choose to follow Jesus. But that is very different from the way that freedom is looked at in our society and our culture, which frequently looks at it more as a matter of simply being freedom from anything that would hold you back to doing whatever you want to do. And it's consistent, as you can imagine, with individualism. So there's a lot of individualism going on. So you see that the topic of our class this evening, freedom, is about that which, when we say we're created in the image and likeness of God, one of the main reasons that we say that is that we share in that quality of being able to love that is the product of the exercise of freedom. So that freedom isn't just, a nice topic or something that we should, be interested in or be in favor of. But freedom goes to the very heart of how we understand who God is and who we are. Why is that? Because it's all about love. And you cannot love if you're not free. So that ultimately this whole series that we're talking about here, discernment, is about discrete love, discerning love. It's not about following rules, even though there are rules and they can be helpful. It's about love. And what is the source of that love? It is the inner life of the God of creation, the God that we've come to know in the Hebrew scriptures and in the life, passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So it's freedom. Freedom in relation and in communion. We have to be aware of all of those things that limit the exercise of this freedom to love. And we know that in us. So there is whatever diminishes or frustrates it. And also whatever takes away from our capacity or our tendency toward, we have that tendency toward confusion and delusion, how we can delude ourselves and get off on the wrong track or pursue, things that really are not so good for us or for others. We have to be free from those things too. So that, yes, our concept of freedom isn't just we also have to be aware of the things that hold us back, the things that hold us down. Oh, and by the way, the means by which God frees us for freedom is the life of prayer, a spiritual life. What's going on in my prayer? What's going on in my spiritual life? We are being freed for freedom. This involves a disciplined learning of the ways of God's freedom in relation to yourself, in relation to other people, in relation ultimately to God. Yeah, so in relation, all those kinds of relations, okay? Freedom with respect to all those things toward a sweetness of love. Yeah, remember we were saying it's all going toward love. Love that's really beyond words. One of the implications then of the way that we are led in the direction of freedom, because freedom is fundamental for loving, is through the invitation that God continually gives us and provides us to respond. Remember, we said in the first model, God acts and we respond. What is God's act? Is God's act an imposition of a rule? An imposition of a law? Or is it an invitation to respond? Because you see, the difference is that if we really weren't free, God would impose things. But because we're free, of necessity, God really needs to simply invite us so that we can cooperate or we cannot cooperate. And God is not going to force us. a discerning life has to be open, not just to, being hit on the head by God, do this, don't do that kind of approach, but has to be open to invitations, which sometimes are subtle. They're not, that clear. You have to kind of pay attention to how God might be nudging you, in this direction rather than another direction, in life, when we have to make decisions. So we need to think a lot about what it means to be in our life of prayer, fundamentally experience the presence of God, experiencing that presence, but not as something that comes giving us commands. God told me today to do X, Y, or Z, but rather a God who is kind of like in the Old Testament, the prophet that heard God in the wind, that heard God, in the whispering, that heard God in the quiet, that heard God in the silence, that kind of thing. So the development of freedom and a discerning life requires an ongoing ability to become, to pay attention and to listen. And as we've said before in many ways so far, yes, the life of prayer is fundamentally a life of listening and putting ourselves in that atmosphere of silence that allows us to really hear the whispers, or the invitations, the invitations that God sends us. So we need to be alert to those things. So in this context, I want to mention something that Father Brendan already did mention, the principle and foundation, which is one of the earliest exercises in the spiritual exercises. It's called the first principle and foundation, okay? And it really is a remarkable thing that goes to the point about what our life is really about and what we're doing here. And for Ignatius of Loyola, for him, this was kind of the central focus of how he thought about himself. And it's very radical. It's very radical. This is the a translation of the first principle and foundation done by a classmate of mine who wrote this article, Father Brackley, who passed away a few years ago. But I think it captures the idea. It's at the very bottom of page 10 there, and it goes like this. Human beings are created to love with their whole heart and soul, essentially by loving and serving their neighbors. In this way, they participate in God's plan to bring all creation to completion. Notice, they participate. So, yeah, exactly. In other words, God's plan is not finished, but we have a role in it. That's what that word means. They participate in God's plan to bring all creation to completion and so arrive at their own ultimate fulfillment, eternal life, okay? Now notice what he says next. The other things on the face of the earth are created for human beings and to help them to pursue the end for which they are created. The other things on the face of the earth, everything else on the face of the earth, is created to help us achieve our purpose, our end. From this, it follows that we ought to use these things to the extent that they help us toward that end and free ourselves from them, the other things around us, the material things, the opportunities, the situations, whatever. Free ourselves from them to the extent that they hinder us from that. For this reason, it is necessary to make ourselves, now this is a very Ignatian word, indifferent to all created things. That word in the Ignatian sense, it doesn't mean I don't care. Frequently the word indifference in English can be almost, I don't care one way or the other. No, what it means is free to go either one way or to go another way, okay? We make ourselves indifferent in that sense. Indifferent to all created things. In regard to everything which is left to our free will and is not forbidden. I mean, for instance, if I'm a father, I can't feel myself free from taking care of my kids. There are certain things that I must do. But there are a lot of other things that I can do them or I can't, or I don't have to do them, okay? And now going about doing this, being indifferent in that sense, in such a way that for our part, we not, and notice this, pay attention, we not seek health rather than sickness, riches rather than poverty, honor rather than dishonor, a long life rather than a short one. And so in all other matters, wanting and choosing only that which leads more to the end for which we are created. Now, do you understand what he's saying here? What St. Ignatius is saying here, and this is really the key of his whole existence and the insight that he had, and he didn't invent it because there were other great saints who had it. But it was that, in Spanish we say primero Dios, primero, not segundo, not tercero, not cuarto, but primero, first, God first, God first, God first. And Ignatius, who was really driven to a certain extent to be consistent, to be coherent, his idea was, well, if we really are putting God first, let's put him first. But of course, this is terribly difficult, isn't it? Because does it mean being indifferent to whether we have good health or bad health? Being indifferent to whether we live a short life or a long life? Being indifferent to whether we're rich or poor? Well, the answer Ignatius gives is yeah. Okay? So now, does this make any sense? If it's all about love, of course it makes sense. Because when you really love, you're willing to give up your life. For those who you love, you give it, we know that. Of course, we frequently don't have a lot of opportunity, we don't have to do that. But, if a parent can give their life for their child, they'll do it. So they become really indifferent because of the power of the love in their relationship. So Ignatius, just using that logic, he extends it to the rest of life. So that ultimately what we're looking for is to grow in this kind of indifference. Now, obviously, are we going to succeed completely? I don't know. I haven't, I don't know about you, of attaining that kind of love of God that is so total, that this makes sense, being truly indifferent to a long life or a short life, to honors, to this, that, and the other thing. It really is, let's put it this way. In the spiritual exercises, at the very beginning, St. Ignatius says, hey, everybody, this is where we're shooting for. This is what it's about. Pay attention. And then the rest of it is, how can I possibly develop that intensity of love? Well, the answer is follow Jesus Christ. Pay attention to the gospel. And maybe we'll move in that direction, huh? We're talking about the development now of freedom in the context of spirituality and discernment and prayer. And another term for that would be interior freedom. Interior freedom. So there are different ways to think of this interior freedom. One of them is that the image that helps us see it is the image of the pilgrim. Spiritual writers who are familiar with the life of St. Ignatius pointed out that one of his favorite ways of talking about himself, of referring to himself, was to say, the pilgrim, el peregrino, the pilgrim. And that comes up in his autobiography quite a bit. Yes, but what's so important about that image? The image is that we are engaging and paying attention to the context around us. A pilgrimage, you know, is not the same of going on a tour exactly, you know, because that's not what was involved, especially in the 15th century or 16th century when Ignatius lived, you know. There were a lot of dangers, and there were a lot of, it was hard. It was, you know, either on foot or on a donkey or on animals or something like that. So, and there are, you know, dangers, and there are changing landscapes as we move along. So it's an interesting image to think about ourselves spiritually as really pilgrims. The Spirit working in us is the teacher. Okay, so once again, we have to pay attention to the Spirit. In getting in touch with the Spirit and with where God is leading us in our small and big decisions, we have to remember that the Gospels are where we need to constantly be returning to the Paschal mystery, the life, passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Gives us and that's the word, embodied, the embodied form of freedom. See, it's nice to talk about, you know, freedom in general, but what does freedom mean in the concrete? The life of Jesus, the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, that God in the second person, the Son of God, entering into human life, entering into a culture, entering into a certain moment in history, subjecting himself to what we all experience in our human reality. That is an embodied form of freedom. It's not some nice idea, but it takes real concrete form. So I want to talk now about 4 dynamics that in the spiritual exercises, when you go through the weeks of the exercises, and when you engage, you know, in the prayer and the scriptures that St. Ignatius proposes, that you begin to get the picture about the movements, the directions in which we can move as we exercise our freedom, as we make our choices, as we do what we're going to do with our life. And these are pretty straightforward. The first one is evil. We can pursue to do evil. Yeah, we are sinners. And some of us can, you know, pursue it. Now, some people are pretty much totally focused on doing evil. I have not met many people like that, but I think they might exist. Characterized by selfishness, violence, and we could call this the spirit of darkness. Huh? There's a spirit of darkness, and Lord knows there are many dark things going on in our life today and in the world, huh? The second dynamic in life is really kind of interesting, and it's one I think we're very familiar with too. It's the thing that really moves me, if I'm into this dynamic, is the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of comfort, the pursuit of safety. Third dynamic, and this is where it gets very subtle. It gets very subtle and very deceitful, engañoso, as we say in Spanish, engañoso. This dynamic is the good life. I imagine that all of us are into the good life, right? With the good life, I mean, you know, we work, we want to be responsible, we want to have a good reputation. Who doesn't want to have a good reputation? We want to have a good reputation. Yes, and you know, it's nice to get honors. Yeah, it's nice to be honored. Oh, influence, that would be nice if we had influence. That we seek. How can I be influential, you know? Wealth, that's a biggie. So many people are focused on wealth. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with any of these things, right? No, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of those things. And indeed, people who are, you know, paying their taxes and not committing crimes and, you know, volunteering every now and then to serve in the whatever, you know, or going to mass every Sunday. That's great. And we could, Tetlow calls that humanism. In a positive sense, humanism, you know, it's living a good life, being a responsible person, so forth. That's it, isn't it? That's what we do. And if we do that and we do it well, then we'll go to heaven. It kind of is functional with the Western model that we talked about in the first session, okay? Now, what Father Tetlow points out is that Ignatius was not a big friend of any of those first three dynamics. He didn't, obviously, he wasn't going to be, you know, the dynamic of evil or the dynamic of pleasure and comfort, but he wasn't even a big friend of this good life dynamic, the one that so many of us, including us priests, including religious people, can be into. But the point that Ignatius of Loyola, and of course not just Ignatius of Loyola, the point that Jesus Christ makes with his life, death, passion, and glorious resurrection is that that's not what it's about. What it's about is very simple, but that's exactly the challenge. Following Christ. What does it really mean to follow Christ? And are we free to really follow Christ? Well, if you're following Christ, what does it mean? It's the way of the cross. Self-sacrificial love, agape, giving one's life for one's friends. A Eucharistic people for others, huh? Yeah. Ignatius, when you really get into the exercises, you see how consistent he was, and he was constantly driving in the direction of moving us to that option, to that decision, to that discernment, to that freedom that allows us to follow, really follow Christ. You know, not just a, you know, blah, 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 you know, but to really follow in the path of Jesus of Nazareth. And so that's what it's about. The Christian spiritual life is to be free for that, not for all this other stuff. In the way of understanding the spiritual exercises, we see that Ignatius proposes many forms of prayer. The spiritual exercises really is a compendium of forms of prayer rooted more than anything on the Lectio Divina, okay, which was an ancient form of prayer in the church that developed especially in monasticism, in the monastic tradition, and Ignatius was familiar with it. But he brought it all together and made an interesting combination. And he uses many of these forms of prayer: meditation, contemplation, these kinds of things, and regular prayers, the kinds of prayers we are used to, that we're taught as children, you know, the prayers that we memorize. All of that is prayer. And Ignatius is very much in favor of it, of all of those things, to use them insofar as they unite us with God. Huh? But the form of prayer that is most characteristic of Ignatius Loyola, and the most original to him, is called the Examen of Consciousness. And that goes right to the heart of the question that we're dealing with, because he has several insights pertinent to how we really become free. Questions that are attached to why the Examen of Consciousness as a form of prayer is so important in the Ignatian tradition. Three simple points. Of all of the qualities that we can cultivate that help us become freer to respond to the invitations that God gives us in life, of all of the qualities that we could cultivate, Ignatius seemed to suggest that gratitude is the most important. And so in the examination of consciousness, the very first moment in it has to be, after we put ourselves in God's presence, as we always do when we pray, is to acknowledge God's gifts, whatever they be, in the moment, in the day, in the period that we're reflecting on, Okay? Spirituality and the life of prayer is always grounded on reality, awareness, consciousness. And so to grow spiritually, we need to get in touch with what's really real in our life. And that can be, yes, what's going on around us, others, our circumstances, our world, yes, pay attention to it, but also ourselves, our inner life, aware of the reality of what we feel and what we desire most authentically, most really. Okay, the third, and more than anything else, what's going on in this examination of consciousness is becoming aware of our motivations. The motivations at the deepest level of our conscience, and purifying those motivations. Taking on the mind of Christ. Taking on the mind of Christ. So, you know, we have all kinds of motivations, and some of them are good, some are bad, some are indifferent. But what are they? Because to the extent that we are motivated, we're going to act. And when we're not motivated, we're not going to act. And since love shows itself in action, we have to be properly motivated. So then the question is, what is our motivation? I mean, you see what I mean? It's not rocket science, but that is a very key moment that Ignatius proposes that we engage in once or twice a day, you know, which can be done in, very briefly, it can be done in 10 minutes. It can be done, you know, it's not a complicated, prolonged kind of prayer, but it really is a key, and it's intimately connected to what the topic of our program here, discernment, and most certainly the cultivation of freedom, okay? I really congratulate you for the fact that you're here and that you're spending time trying to grow in your freedom to love God and love your neighbor. And that's what it's all about. So I'll end with these reflections. St. Francis's life, this is St. Francis of Assisi, indicates to us that if we persevere in prayer, we will find God in the center of our lives, and the bitter will become sweet, as when Francis kissed the leper. However, if we stay in the plane of mediocrity, then the bitter may remain bitter. To trust in the power of God's grace through darkness, isolation, bitterness, and rejection is to be on the way to becoming prayer, because it is the way to freedom in God. For prayer, that deep relationship of God breathing in us requires change and conversion. And where there is change, there is the letting go of the old and the giving birth to the new. To pray is to be open to the new, to the future in God. The way of life passes through change, and ultimately the change from death to life. Prayer is the way of life, because in prayer we are invited to change and to grow in love. And then finally, Father Rohr reflects, I find myself in prayer much of the time right now, not simply because of the limitations of our current circumstances, but because I want to be a witness to such divine freedom. I believe it is this kind of prayer that may keep us from simply hoping things quickly return to normal, though that is a comforting thought to many, and instead praying for the courage to change and grow in love. Such courage is surely what we and the world truly need. So on that note, I wish you all good evening, and take care. Buenas noches.